morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS. My name is Kurt Campbell. I spent many wonderful years here, and it's great to be back at CSIS. I currently help run with Michelle Flournoy the Center for a New American Security, and over the last couple of months, we've been working very closely with CSIS to produce the product that you have in front of you. Let me just say a couple of words about it, and then we'll go directly into our presentations. About a year and a half ago, this group decided that it would be important to begin a dialogue between groups of people that normally don't spend very much time together, and that would be climate scientists, people who think about issues associated with the science of climate, and those people who spend most of their time thinking about national security. And what was interesting about this collaboration is that many of us had no experience with each other before that, knew very little about the language, the experience, the methodology of the other camp, but over the course of about a year and a half, we were able to develop a common language and a common approach to a set of issues that I think will come to define in many respects some of the public policy challenges in front of us over the course of the next several years. I will not speak for the group, but I will tell you that I've worked on a number of alarming issues over the course of my career in national security, whether it be terrorism, the rise of major challenges in the East, issues associated with nuclear proliferation, and even issues during the Cold War associated with what would be the consequences of a major nuclear engagement between the United States and the Soviet Union. I must say that I've rarely worked on a set of issues that were more troubling, more concerning, and require more urgent attention. And I think one of the things that we want to underscore for you, both with this report and some of the other work that we propose to do, is that this set of policy options confronting this generation of public policy and national security officials around climate change may come to be the defining issue of our age. I believe that. I think you'll have to read the report and interact with us over the course of this morning to draw your own conclusions. Just before we get started, I want to thank in particular CSIS for putting on this very nice event, and a number of people, as you can imagine, were involved in the production of this report. Much of this is fairly dense science, and we've wanted it to be very heavily footnoted, and so presentation matters. And I want to just thank Alex from Crabtree, who helped put this wonderful report together for us. And a number of people have assisted us, and their names don't always appear, but as you all know, the work behind the scenes, the tireless work sort of in editing and rewriting has just been extraordinarily valuable to this report. And I want to thank in particular Whitney Parker, Sharon Burke, Sharon who now runs our Energy and National Security project at the Center for a New American Security, is going to take these issues and expand on them over the course of the next several months. Billy Santortson, my able special assistant, very wonderful guy, and Christine Parthamore, who edited every word of this report. So to those people, we want to thank in particular. What we'd like to do today is give plenty of time for questions and interactions about the report, so we're going to move briskly through our agenda today. We're going to begin with Jay Gullidge. He's going to give you some background around the science. As you can see from this report, what we have tried to do is not talk about the present. We've tried to posit three specific scenarios into the future, what we might call expected or medium-term consequences, more dire consequences of concern, and then really cataclysmic potential outcomes over the course of the next 50 years or so. We tried to back each of these up with science as opposed to just predicting out into the future. And then, of course, we've drawn on John McNeill to give us a sense of whether history and the experience of other civilizations and other cultures gives us anything in terms of lessons to how to think about this going forward. I'll just conclude with one thing in terms of how you think about prognosis. We now have about 20 or 25 years from which to base our estimations about how to match up reality with climate predictions. And what we have learned by and large is that on almost every issue, whether it be the disappearance of ice, the increase in temperatures, flooding, climate scientists have always erred very, very low on the predictive scale. And I think that suggests that there are many other factors that are not, and it talks to their inherent caution and care when it comes to scientific approaches. But overall, it should give us some cause for concern as we look out into the future and not expect the lowest expectations of the predictions of the IPCC report, but really to think about the more worrisome, higher ranges of estimates that we've seen over the course of the last year or so. With that, Jay, let me turn over to you. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and get started if you can just keep, there's just a couple of illustrations I'd like to have. So that Kurt set this up well. I think that you know, my role as a scientist in this project, and we consulted with a large number of other scientists as well, was to think about these scenarios in terms of what is plausible as opposed to the scientist's typical mode, which is what is probable. And as Kurt suggested, there are many indications at this point that scientists may have underestimated their probabilities as far as the extent and rate of change goes due to global warming in the climate system. So the point of this assessment really is to consider what's plausible at different levels of climate change in an effort to assess security risks. And that is a different mode of thought from what say the IPCC does, which is to assess current scientific understanding, and that's just a different concept. So I want to pose the question, what is it that scientific projections of climate change and their impacts can tell us today? Now, this is a moving target, and I think they'll be able to tell us more and more as time goes by, but what can they tell us now? Well, many of the predictions that have been made for decades appear to be very solid. We're seeing changes that are very much in line with the large-scale patterns that projections, both in terms of computer models and other types of projections and predictions have been made that are coming to pass. Land surface warming is greater than ocean surface warming. The poles are warming more than the equator. We're seeing global scale losses of ice and of all forms. We're seeing an acceleration of sea level rise. That was just recently detected for the 20th century and was a real key factor for confirming that the global climate is responding to global warming. Other things, other patterns of change are being observed now. So these predictions of patterns are very solid. That's large-scale patterns. Very small-scale regional patterns are still difficult for reasons that were also predicted ahead of time. However, we know that the models and the assumptions that we use to make projections exclude a variety of potential amplifying feedbacks in the climate system. We know this, so we've known this from the start, and there was the potential for underestimation of change as a result of that. These include, you know, changes in the ecosystems that normally take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, converting to sources of carbon dioxide with warming or drought, for instance. Thawing of permafrost in Arctic soils that would release methane. These are examples of positive feedbacks that are not included. And there is now evidence that these feedbacks are becoming active in the climate system, and they're not in the models. Second, as Kurt said, projections for, we now have we have observations for a couple of decades now, mostly from very high quality satellite data that have monitored different parts of the climate system. And in most of the cases that we can look at, the models have been underestimating the rate of change or how soon the changes would be observed. These include loss of polar ice, loss of the rate of loss of retreat of glaciers, changes in northern forests, global precipitation change, and the rate of global sea level rise have all been observed and underestimated for the past couple of decades. No projection capability yet, right? Okay. Well, what this is telling us is that there is a different shape to the uncertainty curve for impacts. That is, instead of, you know, having a bell-shaped curve, the impacts could be smaller, the impacts could be lower, and there's an equal probability either way. Based on our current projections, that's not the way it is. In fact, the higher risk is that the tail of that curve for higher risk is stretched very far out, and the lower risk is squinched in toward the mean. And so what we really have is a higher chance than we ever thought of coming in at very severe impacts as opposed to less severe impacts. So with that background, I dug into mostly the IPCC, the recent IPCC report, but also other peer-reviewed scientific literature to look at what the plausible higher levels of change might be, and came up with 3 scenarios. The first scenario is what we came to deem expected change. I actually think it's a misnomer because we know that in fact we've been underestimating, but the definition of expected change in this case is the mid-level projections of the IPCC. Whatever they project for the next to the year 2040, that's expected change in our context. So I took those out and came up with a temperature change, a mid-range temperature change of 1.3 degrees Celsius above 1990 levels, which is what the projections are in the IPCC, and a sea level rise of 23 centimeters, or about 9.5 inches, or about 9 inches. And then from that, I said, well, what if they're wrong? What if they're underestimating? The feedbacks kick in. There's a larger response to warming than expected. Maybe they could be off by a factor of 2. So I doubled the temperature to 2.6 for our next scenario, which is what we're calling severe climate change for the year 2040. Now, that seems arbitrary. You double it. Well, I go into great detail in the chapter about how, I doubled it and looked at that and compared it to other projections and so forth, and actually it turns out to be fairly reasonable in terms of some high-end projections, not mid-range, but some high-end projections that include some of the carbon feedbacks to get close to that. So I decided it was plausible. And that was associated with also a 1/2 meter of sea level rise, which is very extreme for the time period, but I go into the chapter as to how I derived that. And then the catastrophic scenario plays out over 100 years. And we did that because it was my belief that we could not, let me go over here. All these slides are not in the presentation. I always have extras. This is an illustration of how the risk distribution is actually playing out now that we have some observations. Traditionally, we think there's a bell curve, and risk could be, risk of or the probability of larger or smaller impacts is equal, but really from observations we're seeing something more like this. This report is trying to assess what we might be looking at if it turns out to be out here somewhere. And this is a plausible concept based on the current science. Okay, so this is the assumptions of the 3 scenarios that I've just been describing. This table describes the warming and sea level rise that I derived from my research. For the 100-year level, the main difference is we wanted to explore what would happen if we had large-scale climate shifts, such as massive abrupt sea level rise of like 2 meters and a shutdown of the Atlantic overturning circulation. And it was my judgment, supported by my research, that this isn't going to happen by 2040. If you want to look at them, and you want to be plausible, then you got to give it longer, and so we take it out to 2100 for that scenario. And with a warming of 5.6 degrees, which is very plausible, I mean, actual projections do get that high, and 2 meters of sea level rise. And the chapter goes into great detail of where that comes from. I don't have time to discuss it. You won't find it in the IPCC. The IPCC actually declined to give either a best estimate or an upper end for sea level rise. Okay, now what I did once I had those levels of change derived is I went into the IPCC report and a few other sources, and I just dug out what they say is going to happen if we have the amount of warming that the scenario represents. And so this figure may be familiar to some people. It's from the Stern report, but the Stern report got the information from the Working Group 2 of the IPCC assessment. This is just a more charismatic version of a figure that's in the IPCC. And so this shows where, temperature-wise, our scenarios fall on this impacts chart. And it just gives you a general conceptual idea of what types and what level of impacts would be associated with each level of warming. This is where we are today. This is our expected scenario, severe scenario, and catastrophic scenario. The things that generally distinguish these three scenarios, the expected scenario is characterized by an increase in extreme weather events, a small level of sea level rise that would probably affect some of the lowest lying coastal areas. These happen to be include some important farming regions for the developing world and for the United States, for that matter. The Sacramento Delta is below sea level, for instance, although we probably can mostly protect that up to that level of sea level rise. The low latitude developing nations would be the most strongly affected, and in fact in some of the northern developed countries, agriculture might even benefit from this level of warming on that time scale. Others probably will already be feeling effects of more drought and heat. The severe scenario gets to the point where nobody's benefiting now. There's no net benefit of this much warming, especially on such a rapid time scale. We're having a lot of drought, a lot of severe heat waves every year in many countries. We've got 1 or 2 billion people suffering from low water supplies. We're getting increasing documentation of species extinctions. This is hypothetical, of course. Rising intensity of all of these extreme weather events, and getting into real serious risk now of some irreversible changes in the climate system. And then finally, the catastrophic scenario is more of all of the above, plus some large-scale climate shifts, collapse of the Atlantic, overturning circulation, which cools northwestern Europe, but actually warms most of the rest of the globe. That's something that a lot of people haven't caught on to about that. It also could dramatically shift precipitation patterns globally through atmospheric, what we call teleconnections. If that were to happen, if we had a fundamental reorganization, we might lose rain in one or more of our main grain belt regions, grain exporting regions. There are only about 6 or 7 of them. If we lost, precipitation patterns in 2 or 3 of them, it could be really serious for food supplies. And of course, with that level of warming, we've just got very extreme heat, very extreme drought, very extreme intensification of heavy rainfalls and so forth, in addition to all the rest of these things. So that sets the stage for the 3 scenarios that we will hear about from people who actually know something about security today. And thank you.
Thanks, Shay, with that. We'll go in order from John Podesta through Leon Firth to Jim Woolsey, each of our scenarios as developed by Jay. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Kurt, and thank you for your leadership on this project. I want to thank Jay for guiding us on the science. And, of course, I want to thank my co-author, Peter Ogden, from the Center for American Progress. Our chapter was based on the A1B greenhouse gas emissions scenario of the 4th assessment report of the IPCC. It's on a 30-year horizon. We're looking at what will happen by 2040. In our scenario, we imagine, and I think imagine is probably the wrong word. We predict a scenario in which people and nations are threatened by massive food and water shortages, devastating natural disasters, and deadly disease outbreaks. We believe this is inevitable. There's no foreseeable political or technological solution that will enable us to avert the majority of the climatic impacts projected under this, what I would say, low-case scenario. The world will confront this climate change scenario even if, for instance, the United States were to enter immediately into an international carbon cap and trade system. If Senators Warner and Lieberman passed this afternoon their bill and somehow it made it through the House and the President signed it, this scenario is quite likely. It also assumes that climate change, as Jay noted, does not trigger any significant positive feedback loops that would actually multiply the effects of what's going on here. I think it's not alarmist to say that this scenario may be the best we can hope for. It's certainly the least we ought to be prepared for. The geopolitical consequences of climate change are as much determined by local political, social, and economic factors as by the magnitude of the climate shift itself. As a rule, I think wealthy countries, while they may suffer the greatest economic losses in absolute terms, they'll be better able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, while the disadvantaged will suffer the most. For example, an increase in rainfall can be a blessing for a country that has the ability to capture, store, and distribute the additional water. However, it's a deadly source of soil erosion for a country that does not have adequate land management practices or infrastructure. I'd cite you to Nepal as an example of that. In absolute terms, warming will be greatest towards the poles. If those of you who got up this morning and turned down Matt Lauer in Greenland or Ann Curry at the South Pole at McMurdo Bay, you'll understand that. But developing nations in the Earth's lower latitude, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, I think will be most adversely affected. These are the people who have contributed to the problem the least, but indeed will bear the bulk of the negative consequences in this 30-year horizon. We identify a certain set of dominoes that are likely to occur where we tried to get down with some granularity to where they are situated, what the cascading geopolitical implications are from a national security perspective, and we focus primarily on migration and immigration, on water competition, and on disease. With respect to migration and immigration, I think you see species on the move around the globe today. You're going to see people on the move in much greater numbers as these scenarios come to pass. In the United States, I think you'll see additional stress, particularly on the southwest border, where the climate change scenario looks to create a good deal of weather-related water stress on the desert southwest of the United States and northern Mexico. I think you'll also see increased pressure from the Caribbean as these decades roll out. But we identify three regions where climate-induced migration will present the greatest geopolitical challenges. Those are South Asia, Africa, and Europe. As a result of sea level rise, I think Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable to these migration patterns that will generate political tension as people, again, are on the move and traverse the region. There are many contested borders and territories in that region. It coincides, I think, also with clear signs of rising Islamic extremism within Bangladesh today, and that's likely to be exacerbated. India will be subject to its own stress from climate-induced stress, but it will also have to take greater measures to secure its own border. In Africa, we see a high threat of regional conflagration, particularly in East Africa, due to both the concentration of climate impact and its effect on weak and failing states in East Africa, which is already perhaps after the Middle East the most profound security challenge for the United States in dealing certainly with Al-Qaeda. But we also note that Nigeria faces the twin pressures of desertification in the north and rising sea levels, particularly in Lagos, in the southern part of Nigeria, which will put, again, great stress on its government. I mentioned Europe. We anticipate a surge of migration of Muslim immigrants, both from Africa, as we see today, as well as from South Asia. That will put greater stress of the trends that we're already seeing emerge in France and other countries in Europe. With respect to water concentration, the effects, I think, are most profound in our view in the Middle East. Turkey is in from the perspective of being in a regional position, I think will be likely to be strengthened because it's the headwaters of both the Tigris and Euphrates River. It's the only country in the Middle East that does not depend on water supplies that originate outside its own borders. But beyond that, I think that while we're not likely to see water wars per se, countries will more aggressively pursue the kinds of technological and political solutions that currently enable them to exist in regions that are really stretched probably already to their water limits. It also, I would just note that this coincides with an expected population boom in the area. There's an intricate water politics of the region. It's been described as hydropolitical security complex. The Jordan River physically links the water interests of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian territories themselves are really highly vulnerable to water loss in those areas. So I think what you see as a kind of hotbed today of global instability, I think, will become exaggerated by this pressure on lack of water. And then with respect to disease, I think that climate change will have a range of decisively negative effects on global health during the next 3 decades. Again, particularly in the developing world, the World Health Organization is nearing completion of a study projecting that the number of deaths directly linked to climate change will exceed 300,000 by 2030, but the total number of lost disease-adjusted life years, a measurement that accounts also for injury and premature deaths, will surge to about 11 million. These numbers are all the more alarming because they only take into consideration a fraction of the impact that climate change will have on the spread of disease. Waterborne and vector-borne diseases like malaria will be particularly prevalent in countries that experience significant additional rainfall. Again, the chapter notes some challenges to the capacity of the World Health Organization to manage that growing instability, and reflects back on similar challenges for disease epidemics in the 19th century, pointing towards solutions. Just let me briefly note that we did do an analysis of kind of a winners and losers analysis based on fuel types, and took a look at who might profit from that. I don't think, as Kurt often notes, there aren't any real winners over even the midterm in this scenario, but Russia is likely to have its hand strengthened geopolitically with respect to its position, particularly with respect to natural gas. There's a lot of interest in nuclear power. We talked about in that question and answer period, but we see an attendant proliferation risk if there's a widespread adaptation of nuclear power and nuclear know-how. And then finally, on the upside, we see some potential for the production of biomass-based liquid fuels, particularly in South America and in parts of Africa. Just to close off with a couple of last points. One is the United States, I think, today is seen as a first responder to catastrophic climate events. And I think you could look to the tsunami lesson in Indonesia or other circumstances where the U.S. military is really on the front lines of trying to respond to catastrophic events. But I think that given the scale, the range, and the number of such events in the future, I think we're not very well positioned, and our planning is not very strong with respect to the ability of evolving our roles and missions of particularly the Army and the National Guard at home, and the Army and other sources, and particularly the Navy overseas. And one other point to note, because this is a security crowd, that long-term viability of some bases, particularly situated on islands and low-lying coastal areas like Diego Garcia, are probably called into question by the end of this period of time. I think that at the global level, the UN institutions need to be substantially revised, not just talking about the framework convention. We proposed an E8, which one of the presidential candidates will be talking about, I guess, this morning. Senator Clinton has endorsed that concept. But we're also, I think that particularly when you think about the refugee problem and the migration problem, the UNHCR right now has jurisdiction, if you will, over about 9 million refugees. There are already about 25 million environmental refugees in the globe. That's expected to rocket to at least a couple hundred million in the next couple of decades. And I think the institutional framework at the UN is ill-equipped to deal with this. So let me close by just saying that we celebrate the fact, or at least Leon and I celebrate the fact, that Al Gore won the Nobel Peace Prize along with the IPCC. And I would just note that he did not win the Nobel Prize for chemistry. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think the scenarios being laid out here today ought to tell you why the Nobel Committee chose climate change and its impacts on the security dimensions of the globe to award that most, I think, deserving award. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Leon, for the second scenario, please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Many of the specific observations that you will hear the chapter authors make are duplicative. They're same conditions applied to the same places. It's a question of how high the flame is under the pot that we're cooking. I want to talk to you perhaps a little bit more about methodology than you might have expected. At GW, where I'm pleased to be a research professor, I teach a course on forward engagement, which is an effort to get students to think out of the box ahead of time and across categories. And that involves an emphasis on trying to figure out what forecasting is good for. That leads to an appreciation for the real role of complexity in the nature of things as human beings experience them and in the formation of policy. And some of the insights that come out of that apply to this situation are that the customary distinction between what is internal to the U.S. and what is external to the U.S. goes away. These things are inextricably interwoven and cannot be understood if they are separated one from the other. It's also necessary to understand the role of nonlinear change. In the regime where John is describing events, you may still have a situation where existing institutions can adapt and retain their cohesion. But by the time you get to extreme change as defined for me in the scenario and apply it over a generation, you are getting to the point where the rule that I followed applies. That is, extreme nonlinear change to the environment is going to produce extreme nonlinear political and institutional change. It's very important to realize, especially because we're not accustomed to thinking about it, that institutions and policies and politics and even morals actually are linked to the gross forms of the environment that we're accustomed to as a species since the last ice age. What we're talking about here is that these change dramatically. And it follows from that all of the institutional outer shell that we built up is also subject to change, and then you begin to try to figure out what those changes are likely to be. Complexity theory leads you to appreciate that the changes that are going to happen build up over time, but then there is a trigger point, hard to predict, but out there. And beyond that, new forms are going to appear suddenly and dramatically. Some of those new forms, in the case of extreme climate change, could actually be positive. That is, the prospect, not the reality. If we wait for the reality, it's too late. But the prospect of arriving at the consequences of extreme climate change may galvanize world reaction, and that might show up in the form of a tremendously accelerated search for and application of solutions, both political, economic, and technological, to try to get us on at least some of the more modest curves of change that one can imagine. On the other hand, if this doesn't happen, and right now if you did a straight forecast, you would assume that it doesn't look that hopeful. If it doesn't happen, then what will happen beyond these trigger points is essentially degenerative, or in the language of complexity, systems failure of one system after another upon which civilization or security as we know it depends, and possibly at the end of it something worse than that. But that's the final scenario, and I'll leave that alone. But in my chapter, looking at the range of change that was presented as the premise, I could see that some of the consequences could essentially involve the end of globalization as we have known it, including the death of the idea of an emerging global civilization as different parts of the earth contract upon themselves in order to try to conserve what they need to survive, and forms of international cooperation that are based on an environment which offers enough give way to relationships that are based on a regime of shortage of the most vital commodities of life. Now, I also felt that it was important to keep in mind that these things are not only security and military, but they are also moral. And I tried to visualize what it would be like if governments that have resources like our own go through a 30-year process of kicking people away from the lifeboat, so to speak, as environmental circumstances become more and more desperate for those who are most vulnerable to them. The ability of wealthy countries like ours might simply not be up to the task of responding in any particular way. Virtually, well, it's not that unthinkable because there are plenty of failures in the records of advanced states to contemplate, but this would be worse, and I think extremely debilitating in the moral terms. It also suggests that the kinds of hatreds that build up between different groups will be accentuated as these groups attempt to move to more clement locations on the planet. Okay, so all these things are in the motion, and again, referring to complexity. Every element of the system is changing within itself, and the system as a whole is changing as these things interact. What this suggests is the need for a new approach to the management of this extraordinarily complex problem. It suggests the need to rethink the way in which governance is done, trying to protect democracy as the key value, but somehow getting greater efficiency out of national and global processes as they come to grips with the consequences of extreme climate change. To get that kind of government, I think we are going to need to put a premium on recognition of early signs of major change, on scenario-based analysis of responses to that change, and rarest of rarities on feedback loops to provide steady information to leaders about what is actually happening as a consequence of their policies once the policies are engaged. That would also include the consequence of the policy of not engaging with this issue as it develops. So those are the insights that I tried to bring to bear on the analysis of the consequences of extreme climate change.
Thank you, Leon, and over to Jim for the most dire predictions, and I want to thank Jim for rearranging his schedule to be with us this morning.
Thanks, Kurt. I'll refer you to pages 84 to 87 of my chapter on how awful things could get. I'm not going to spend time on that in these few minutes I have today because I want to suggest from a height of about 35,000 feet how we ought to, in some cases, think about these issues. Most of us do a pretty good job of multitasking with small and medium-sized matters, but we would like it, please, if there was just one big, overwhelming problem that we had to deal with. And we went through a period of the 90s in which we thought there were no big, overwhelming problems we had to deal with, sort of like the 1920s. It was party time, beach time. But it turns out there is not one, there are two. Rachel Kleinfeld, who used to work with me at Booz Allen, came up with this formulation, which I keep using. She called them malignant and malevolent problems. Malignant problems are like the butterfly effect in chaos theory. Butterfly flutters its wings on one side of the world. Ecosphere is a complex system, creates a tornado on the other side of the world. Seems sort of theoretical until you realize that a tree branch fell on some power lines 4 years ago in August in Ohio, and within 9 seconds, some 80 gigawatts of power are offline in eastern Canada and the United States for several days. Now, that's part of the problem, that our infrastructure, not only the ecosphere, but also our energy systems, are highly complex systems vulnerable to catastrophic collapse from unexpected sources, somewhat the way the human body is vulnerable to malignancy and metastasis from some sort of unknown interference. But so our energy systems are not only vulnerable that way, but terrorists are unfortunately a great deal smarter than tree branches. And I'll refer you to the paper to look at the vulnerabilities of the electricity grid, to electromagnetic pulse in case our Iranian friends decide to give Hezbollah a fishing boat with a scud on it, to collapse from conscious attack on the transformers by terrorists, to hacking into the SCADA, the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition systems. So we have not one set of problems to worry about with respect to our energy systems and much else. We have two. We have the fact that we are, as a society, more or less smoking 6 packs a day and putting ourselves at risk of creating the positive feedback loops, oddly so named because they have very negative effects, and the exponential change that Leon talked about. That essentially metastasis of the ecosphere is certainly a matter of judgment. I've learned a great deal from Jay Gullidge and the other participants in this overall operation, but I think it's important to focus not just on the models, but as James Hansen says, also on the data. Well, 125,000 years ago, between the last 2 ice ages, temperature was only about 1 degree centigrade above where it is now, and sea levels were 4 to 6 meters higher, more than double what's in the catastrophic scenario that I was asked to look at. In the just before the ice ages, some 300 million years ago, world temperatures were around, looks like 5 to 6 degrees above where they are now. They're where they come out at the end of the 21st century in my scenario, and sea levels were some 25 meters higher. 25 meters, even 5, is absolutely stunning in terms of its impact on the world. 25 means the end of the world as we know it. So we have to deal with both these so-called malignant potential changes and malevolent. We don't want to get bogged down, I don't think, in a debate between whether it's more likely to really hit us in 2050 or 2100. We're talking about probably your grandchildren's time rather than your children's. But nonetheless, something that we need to worry about. It's a little bit like saying if we smoke 6 packs a day, are we going to get lung cancer at age 49 or age 53? We don't know exactly where the curve turns. What we need to concentrate on is stopping or at least radically cutting back on our smoking. And there is another reason for stopping putting carbon as much into the atmosphere as we are. And that has to do with the fact that the steps one wants to take in order radically to reduce our contribution to a potential malignant tipping point metastasis of the ecosphere are, on the whole, the steps we also want to take to make our energy system substantially more resilient against potential terrorist attack. The longer version of this paper, which will be published in some months, we didn't have space for the whole dialogue here, I invent a dialogue between what I call a tree hugger and a hawk. The tree hugger is only interested in carbon and doesn't think terrorism is anything you need to worry about. The FBI can deal with it. The hawk is only interested in dealing with the terrorist threat and thinks this global warming stuff is a bunch of sort of liberal nonsense. The terrorist in my scenario is the ghost of John Muir, and the hawk is the ghost of George S. Patton. And what's interesting, and a shortened version of it is in here, what's interesting is that as Muir and Patton begin to discuss what to do about energy, they find that although neither shares the other's substantive view of the main problem, they keep coming back to rather similar solutions. They keep wanting to move against oil for terrorist reasons, avoidance reasons, as well as global warming, and so they can agree on moving toward plug-in hybrid gasoline-electric vehicles and toward alternative fuels and flexible fuel vehicles. They don't pick whether it's ethanol or butanol or whatever, or what the feedstock is, but generally they try to move things toward substituting electricity, as in plug-in hybrids, and substituting alternative liquid fuels, as in ethanol, butanol, renewable diesel, etc., for petroleum products. And with respect to electricity generation, they move very heavily toward efficiency improvements, toward reducing the requirements in buildings, toward changing these kinds of lights that are shining on us, to cogeneration of electricity and heat, to changing the incentives for utilities by moving them away, as California has done, from getting markups on their sales of electricity, and instead pointing them toward investing in energy efficiency. And they move toward distributed generation from the renewables, solar, wind, shallow geothermal, etc. They can agree to some extent. Patton is reluctant to agree to adding to the electricity grid cleanly, that is, with wind farms, large solar plants, maybe nuclear, maybe carbon sequestration and capture for coal-fired power plants. But Patton doesn't like the grid. He says the Maginot Line's at least defensible from one direction. The damned electric grid isn't defensible from any direction. We need to move away from the grid as quickly and decisively as we can. Muir's not sure he agrees, but nonetheless, they do at least have some difference of opinion about large, clean new plants. And the only matter in which they substantially disagree is coal to liquid, because Muir hates the carbon and Patton loves the fact that it's not oil and the coal is here. They kind of agree to disagree about that. But on the whole, you find, I think if you look at this through their eyes or through any tree hugger and hawk eyes, and frankly I kind of consider myself both, you find that there are a lot of things to cooperate on. And the most important thing from our societal point of view, whether it's to make ourselves a lot more resilient against terrorism, or whether it's to move us decisively away from smoking 6 packs a day equivalent in the ecosphere, is to understand that we don't have to win either of these arguments. We don't have to persuade all the hawks to become tree huggers or the tree huggers to become hawks. What we need to do is realize that the things we need to do have a lot in common and to get busy on them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. John.
Right. Thank you, Kurt. My task was to ruminate about whether or not history can be of any use to us as we contemplate a future with climate change on the orders of magnitude under consideration in this project. Can history guide our imaginations? Can it ground our predictions and scenarios? The short answer is no, it can't, not directly, but yes, indirectly it can. With enough skill and irresponsibility, history, like science, can be used to show just about anything. My aim is to do it with responsibility rather than irresponsibility. So the first point is that we have already entered uncharted terrain as regards the significance of climate change upon human affairs. There have been in the deep human past episodes of pronounced climate change, but while the human animal was the same in those distant times, human society was very different. So that the responses available to our Paleolithic ancestors, while perhaps in some senses more limited than the responses available to us now, were in other senses more broad. What they did in most instances was just walk somewhere else. Migration and mobility was the centerpiece of resilience to climate change and to just about all other adverse developments in their lives. But migration and mobility, as some of my colleagues on this panel have alluded to, is an option almost foreclosed in the contemporary world and in the world of the next several decades. So, history can provide some instruction if one unpacks the notion of climate change a little bit and looks to the history of societal responses to nature's shocks, including varieties of natural shock that we imagine will be more frequent and more intense in a greenhouse world. In the historical record, demographically speaking, the most severe natural shocks have been, in declining order of importance, epidemics, drought, flood, earthquake, and volcanic eruptions. And the first three of those, epidemics, drought, and flood, are, as you've heard, the sorts of things that it is likely we will see more of and more intense versions of in the greenhouse future. Now, in the past, survival in the face of these kinds of shocks depended on resilience, mainly in the form, as I said, of migration and mobility, rather than prevention or resistance. However, in the last 200 years, more particularly the last 80 or so, what we might call regimes of resistance and prevention have been erected, especially in the most prosperous parts of the world. This consists of things like vaccination regimes, stockpiling of food against drought-related famine, flood control through channelization of rivers, and so on and so forth. And since the great flu epidemic of 1918-1919, these things have actually worked pretty well. This is partly a matter of luck. Nothing really bad has heaved over the horizon since that flu pandemic, but it's also a matter, to some extent, of prudence and competence in the creation and maintenance of these regimes of resistance and prevention. But what if it turns out that my colleagues are correct and we're not going to prevent climate change and its attendant effects? And what if they're correct and we will see more drought, more flood, more epidemics? These will be local and regional impacts, although they may exist in such number that they reverberate one upon another in ways that past episodes of epidemic, drought, and flood, which were always local and regional impact, did not. Well, in the past, economic impacts of these kinds of natural shocks have been sometimes devastating locally. They have never been significant globally. And that's partly a result of the fact that, especially over the last 200 years, the overall rates of economic growth have been so high that even disasters such as Hurricane Andrew or the Kobe earthquake have been blips in the history of the global economy. That may be encouraging, but remember the two provisos. One, against a background of rapid economic growth, a sort that the global economy never experienced except in recent decades. And secondly, that in the past these shocks have been discrete, separate, and perhaps not as numerous as they are likely to become. Now let me turn to socio-political impacts. as John Podesta alluded to at the outset, security and international politics is very much affected by socio-political conditions and trends. So now I will try to offer some suggestions about socio-political responses to natural shocks in the historical record. First of all, these responses, socio-political ones, in the past have been and in the future are sure to be varied and in some respects contradictory. When it comes to social responses to natural disasters, these in the past have typically both produced greater solidarity amongst peoples affected by the disasters and sometimes among people who are only observers, but also its opposite, greater predation, one person, one group upon another, as order breaks down and conventional rules of restraint seem no longer necessarily to apply. So contradictory responses are to be expected. Beyond that, scapegoating of minorities is also to be expected. This is very routine in societal responses to past natural shocks, ranging from enhanced persecution of European Jews in the wake of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century to the brutal assaults on the Korean minority within Japan during and after the great 1923 earthquake. About a fifth of the Korean population was killed by rioters and by police in that instance. One should also expect, judging by the historical record, a much more energized religious landscape. Societal responses to past natural shocks have normally, I would say almost invariably, included heightened religiosity, both in the form of stronger commitments to established religions, but also in the form of the emergence of novel, eccentric religions, often based on charismatic individuals, never in short supply. Two more points, and then I'll conclude. The historical record also suggests that we should expect rapid erosion of the legitimacy of authority, especially state authority, in the wake of a new turbulent climate system with more and greater shocks in it. We might call this the mandate of heaven problem. The old Chinese dynasties before 1911 enjoyed legitimacy because they allegedly enjoyed the mandate of heaven. But if they no longer seemed able to control, to create order, to maintain order, and to control the workings of nature, this is part of the mandate of heaven, well, they were seen to have lost the mandate of heaven. Modern states have boxed themselves into this corner by assuming responsibility for public health and reasonably smooth functioning of ecological systems. If they can manifestly no longer provide that ecological and epidemiological order, well, they will lose the mandate that they have appropriated for themselves. And their legitimacy, I think it is logical to assume, will erode quickly under these kinds of pressures if they are seen unable to cope. Lastly, and a bit more encouragingly, nature's shocks in times past have sometimes served as a very effective spur to reform, to the creation of more effective governance, more effective maintenance of social and ecological order. That, of course, presumes that institutions survive and endure and have the capacity to reform themselves. And the biggest and nastiest shocks rule that possibility out. So, historically, the ability to withstand shocks and to recover from shocks and to learn effectively from shocks has been very unevenly distributed among societies around the world. That remains the case today, and it is sure to remain the case in the future. The significance of that fact, of this unevenness, is likely to grow if, as my colleagues tell us, climate change leads us to a future with more frequent shocks and more intense ones. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. You all have been very patient and have allowed us to have our say. As you can see, this is a very ambitious and eclectic project, and we'd be happy to take questions. If I could suggest, just identify yourself so you know where we're from. If you want to make a statement, then be sure at the end to attach a "Aren't I right?" or something like that. So please just make yourself known if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, go ahead. I don't know if there's microphones or not, so please go ahead. Looks like there is one coming your way here.
I have a good command voice, too, if I need it. Mike McNerney, Department of Defense. I've got a question about foreign policy responses to the challenges. There's sort of two schools of thought I read about, either a unilateral response, whereas we'll do what we have to do. We're not interested in Kyoto and those types of efforts. We're just going to take our approach. The other extreme is sort of the Kyoto above all, sort of negotiated multilateral responses. And there's probably need for both of those types of responses, but is there room for a third style of response, sort of bilateral, trilateral type approaches with countries of particular concern? So, for instance, could we see the U.S. reaching out to China and India on more focused efforts to address the problem while we wait for sort of longer, more protracted negotiations to go on? Is there room for sort of that more targeted foreign policy, and do you see that in the next couple of years developing?
I'll make a quick comment, and then if others want to just jump in on this. I think actually that's exactly right, and I think there has to be some stronger and more powerful first movers in this environment to be able to move forward. I think the truth is that we often ask for greater cooperation between the United States and China. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had actually very strong cooperation between the United States and China in blocking and discouraging certain kinds of explorations when it comes to understanding the implications of climate change and how it might affect global security and what to do about it. I think the truth is that we will need to see substantial action in this venue that will then serve as a catalyst for larger multilateral efforts, which I also agree with you will likely take a long period of time. So the way I think about it is that the country that has to act first in all likelihood is the United States, which will then hopefully trigger a series of consequences globally. I think it's going to be very difficult to make the case to both China and India, and I think there's a lot of question about residual carbon versus new carbon, and that's going to be hard, but we're not going to be able to get to any of this unless we see some political change in the United States as a whole, and I think that's going to be very difficult, I think, for all the reasons that we've underscored. But hopefully part of this process is that to make the case about why this is such an urgent set of challenges for this generation of leaders. John?
I generally agree with what Kurt said. We did a kind of special takeout on China in the chapter we did. And I think it's important to think about this. The mandate from heaven in China, if you will, is built now around continued rapid growth, 9-10% GDP growth, largely through an industrialization process. It's having tremendous effect on the environmental integrity of the country. And I think all these scenarios that we talked about here play out internally inside of China. And the governing regime, I think, sort of basically gets the fact that maybe the environmental policies are unsustainable, but can't quite either control the distribution of power, particularly down to the provincial level, or begin to slow back the growth if that's what it's going to take in order to put more efficiency into the system and get on a different energy path. The United States obviously has a profound interest in seeing the Chinese make the right decisions about that, but I think that ultimately they're decisions that the Chinese government itself will take. I think I would say if there's a development dilemma in the United States, there's a kind of political dilemma in the U.S. I think that Kurt is correct in arguing that the United States has to be the first mover. We have to embrace the challenge by getting our own house in order, throwing at least 5 of those 6 packs of cigarettes a day that Jim talked about. But I think, beyond that, I think that the idea of actually using and creating the mechanisms which will make the right kinds of investments in China, which means most likely a transfer of wealth from Europe and the United States to China and India and other developing countries is a profound political problem, I think, here, and probably needs to take place through mechanisms that are sort of one-off, World Bank, other kinds of instruments. Conceivably, even the globalized cap and trade system will help ameliorate that. But it hasn't come up on this panel like it comes up on every other panel that discusses climate change. But the production of electricity through coal-fired power plants is, if we don't get on top of that, then the rest of everything we're all doing, as I say, particularly in China, but also in India, will matter little.
Jim.
There are some stunning possibilities for cooperation with China in this area. This is one area where we have no interests that I know of that are really adverse to China's, or vice versa. We don't want China hungry for oil. It makes it be very nice to Sudan and Iran and undercut other things that we want to do. We don't want China building a coal-fired power plant a week and putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Just to take one quick area, photovoltaics is an area that China has worked in very hard, as well as we have here in the United States, and people haven't followed where this technology has gone in recent years, are sometimes really stunned by the numbers. Today in California, you can, for a cost of about 22 or 23 cents a kilowatt hour, buy, if you're a new shopping center owner, power from your roof, power purchase agreement. Somebody will come hook it up and put the photovoltaic cells down, sell it to you for 22, 23 cents long term. Now, that number is about double what peak grid pricing is in the rest of the United States. It's about 11 cents a kilowatt hour, so you have to have those photovoltaics come double in efficiency or come down in cost to about half in order to be competitive with the grid. But in California, the peak numbers are 39 cents a kilowatt hour. So you are already making money in California by putting photovoltaics on your roof and buying the power from your roof instead of the electricity grid. Some of that technology is Chinese. There is no reason at all why we shouldn't have vigorous cooperation with China, because moving toward things like locally generated distributed energy from renewables like photovoltaics is in everybody's interest in policy positions in these countries and helps with a number of different problems. So I think the chance of cooperation with China in some of these areas is really quite striking.
Thanks. Any other questions? We'll take a couple and then just sort of add them up. So yes, ma'am, there, and then next to you there. Yes.
My name is Deborah Cullen Tonio, and I'm with GAO. And my question piggybacks on Mike somewhat. I wanted to know if anybody here on the panel looked at multilateral, bilateral agreements in the past that we could use as options or alternatives to kind of broker the kinds of agreements that we need in all aspects, either the political, geopolitical, the science areas, the health areas. And then the second part of the question is, has anybody from any of our political candidates, have they had some outreach to you on some of these issues, and are you discussing with anybody about the kinds of things that this country is going to face in the near term?
Great. Next question there. Yes, thanks.
Reed Detchen with the Energy Future Coalition. Another two-parter, one for Professor McNeil. It seemed to me that in analyzing the history of natural shocks, one thing that gets overlooked is that natural shocks, by their very nature, are transitory. And we're talking about essentially irreversible changes here, one-way streets, and so we have permanent change as opposed to temporary change, and I wonder if that's a factor in your consideration. And secondly, the issue of disappearance of mountain glaciers showed up on the Jay's chart as being in the mild version of climate change. In other words, inescapable. And given that East and South Asia depend for their water supply on mountain glaciers in large part, I wonder if anybody on the panel would like to comment on the potential for conflict between three nuclear powers in that area.
Excellent question. And then we had someone up here. Why don't we take you, and then we'll get in the second round over here.
I'm John Peterson from the Arlington Institute. Leon, you kind of alluded to the nonlinearity of the whole system in talking about chaos theory, and mentioned tipping points a time or two. But what we know well from nonlinear systems is that when they reach tipping points, they jump to different states, and which raises the whole issue about rapid climate change or abrupt climate change in all of this. And I didn't hear that in the scenarios, and wondered if, in fact, anyone had talked about that, because that's more along the line of what happens with the flu situation scenario.
Thanks. Okay, we'll take it in this order. John, and we'll ask you to talk a little bit about the history here. Leon, if you could touch base on this issue of discontinuous or rapid, dramatic tipping point change, and John, perhaps on the political briefings. I will say, ma'am, that we've done most of our work was really trying to understand what to expect. And I think one of the things that we want to get into, and I think one of the things that Sharon Burke is going to lead for us, is how to think a little bit about regimes and where we can borrow from other experiences, either arms control or multilateral kinds of negotiations, and whether they are applicable to the situations that we face today on climate change. John.
All right, the question put to me asks to differentiate between transitory shocks on the one hand and new regimes on the other, which is very often a useful distinction. In the past, some of the shocks which I mentioned or to which I alluded were indeed just that, transitory shocks. Some of them, however, were, particularly in the disease realm, were actually new regimes. That is, when the Americas first acquired smallpox or typhoid, etc., these were lasting new conditions, and very unfortunate for the populations of the Americas. The new regime of climate change is, I think, going to be felt not just in higher average temperatures, but in greater frequency and greater intensity of discrete shocks. And that may be where the rubber meets the road in terms of the challenges posed to human societies. And if that is the case, then the discrete shocks of the past are indeed useful bases on which to reflect about a new regime which will be felt mainly in the form of discrete shocks.
Well, speed is relative, and the next question is, in relative to what? It's relative to two things. First, what is it that's in the process of changing? And secondly, what is the system that is experiencing the change? Because in the end, you may be able to modulate the rate of change, and you may be able to strengthen the capacity of the affected system to absorb it. And in fact, those are the two main tools that you've got. Try to somehow slow the change down while speeding up and enhancing the ability of the affected system to roll with it. Otherwise, you can get in a situation where The thing that's changing delivers, as in nomenclature, a shot, like a karate chop, to a system, and in fact cracks it, because it does not have the inherent flexibility to adjust itself in the time that's allowed. That's, in a way, a form of good news, because it suggests that people who are concerned about this have at least two levers to play with, one of them having to do with the capacity of institutions, and the other one having to do with methods to prevent shocks from arriving in minimum time.
If I can just add, just a sec, John, just one thing to that question. I do think, for instance, one of the most important factors in understanding the climate system is the role of the oceans, and the role that the oceans have played in buffering and absorbing carbon. And if you go to a place like Woods Hole, and you ask the scientists who are studying the North Atlantic current, for instance, what it would take to shut that down, they don't have a high degree of confidence that they completely understand the dynamics of this. And they said it's entirely possible in the not too distant future that we could see a major shutdown. If that would occur, then we would see exactly the kind of discontinuous tipping point shocks that you describe, which would then likely have other consequences as a result. My own personal view, and it's been heavily influenced by Jay, is that we tend to think about climate. He has a wonderful slideshow about all the myths associated with climate change, one of which is, of course, the United States is relatively invulnerable to these dynamics. In fact, we are very vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable countries on the planet in terms of these effects if they play out. But the idea that the change will be gradual, but in all likelihood there will be major discontinuities and major changes that will be very difficult to adjust to in the short term. Jim, do you want to jump in on
Yeah, on two of the questions, is there a model for previous negotiations? I'd refer you to some writings by my co-chairman on the Committee on the Present Danger, former Secretary of State George Shultz, who thinks the Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbons is probably about the best model for a lot of this. And as far as glaciers are concerned, my scenario includes one brief mention, but something I think I ought to say something about. South Asia, including South China, of course, are highly vulnerable here to glacial melting and to a great deal of disruption. If you look at the demographic trends, Russia, by the middle of the century, should have well under 100 million people in it, about a third Muslim, a smaller population than Yemen. A very large Chinese population headed north to get away from the chaos of the south, particularly given the fact that China has never recognized many of the Tsar's claims in Siberia, could well produce some interesting foreign policy issues in a decade or two or three or four in Central Asia.
John.
Three quick points on the multilateral point. I sort of briefly mentioned this, but I think that there's some ability to create a grouping of the highly emitting nations. We call it the E8, modeled on the G8, to try to a one country, one vote model under the Kyoto Protocol. Probably not going to really be an effective governance model going forward to try to cope with this proposition. But I think the G8 model is also a good way to think about how one coordinates their activity. On mountain glaciers, just very, very briefly, I think South America is another place to look towards near-term impact. There's a good deal of population dependent on mountain glaciers that are rapidly disappearing there. And then on the politics question, I think obviously all of us on this stage in our own way have tried to argue that this needs to be elevated in the presidential campaign. And I think if you look at I'm wearing my best bipartisan hat here. I think if you look at the energy programs of people, you see bipartisan emphasis. Certainly on the Democratic presidential side, Senator Clinton is rolling out another energy program today. You've seen very robust programs from Senator Obama and Senator Edwards. On the Republican side, Senator McCain obviously was one of the leaders on trying to create a regime of cap and trade. But I think there's a difference between having a good website and a good program and demonstrating the kind of leadership that will be necessary to really move the ball forward in a new administration. I think we're all involved in trying to press the case with the current crop of candidates. I would just note that at least as through yesterday, and I watched most of the interview with Fred Thompson on Meet the Press, Tim Russert now is clocking in at about 220 questions to the presidential candidates for appearances on Meet the Press. He has yet to ask a single question about climate change and the implications for the United States. So I think we have a broader job to do than just trying to brief the individual presidential candidates on this. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to call out the press. I think that I mentioned the Today Show. I think that's actually maybe that's a tipping point of the press beginning to understand and deal with this in the quality and the quantity of coverage that it deserves.
Just before I turn over to Leon, one of the things that we found in this process, just to answer your question a little bit more broadly, is that I think the national security community is, relatively well-educated, informed. The lack of knowledge among this cohort on this set of issues is surprising and a little bit alarming. And one of the things that we want to do over the course of the next several years is to try to make sure that this becomes a staple among those who think about national security and foreign policy, that climate change is introduced into that. I think to date the lack of response and the problems that we've seen both politically and substantively in the United States can be attributed to a number of things. But I have to underscore something that John said. I think one of the biggest failures has been the failure of the press. Really a tremendous difficulty in making the case to sort of link the science with the social repercussions. And I think there's a whole host of reasons for that. We were at a meeting, many of us this summer, in which Nick Kristof from the New York Times said, look, the inescapable conclusion that I come to is that we in the press have failed on this issue, and not very many people disagreed with him. Leon.
Well, where the press is concerned, the best thing they can do is repeatedly make the point that not one of the proposals advanced by any of the candidates is likely to operate at the speed and magnitude required to deal effectively with this problem. I don't think anybody deserves to be patted on the head for the quality of their response when measured against what we're discussing here. Now, as for the form of a collaboration, you all seem to be thinking about traditional treaties, bilateral, multilateral, and so on. I think you need to be a little more fluid in your approach and think network. Matters very little whether it's a bilateral, multilateral, or whatnot, so long as you have analyzed the system that you are trying to affect in the climate or in terms of international relations, and assemble mechanisms that, one way or the other, give you a little purchase on that. So as soon as you begin to think in systems terms, you begin to reach out for whatever mechanism is most likely to be appropriate. One thing that's not appropriate is to take a global task and to slice and dice it into bilateral agreements exclusively, because then you will not get the general pattern of cooperation that's needed. We face some of that in terms of the evolution of the global trading regime versus the World Trade Organization. I would like to say that things that we are somewhat underplaying the tremendous power of private enterprise and the profit motive to bring about stunning changes in very short periods of time. That's an optimistic thing. Once the climate of opinion and legislation and regulation change so that it becomes much more of a profit-making matter to go into these things, we might be able to get the acceleration that we require. And the other thing is that it would not be planned. There is in complexity theory the thing called complex adaptive behavior, which just means that when you get a large crowd of people and give them their head, they can come up with some very surprising ideas. And I think that free enterprise provides that that potential.
Take one last round of questions. We'll take three over here. 1, 2, and then if there's another third. Thanks.
Thank you. Graham Pugh from the Department of Energy. I was glad to hear a mention of trade just a moment ago. I'm wondering about the extent to which we need to involve trade mechanisms in a global solution to the problem, because I think we can see that over time what has happened is in restructuring of the economies of the developed nations, we've lowered our energy intensity, and we've shifted that burden to the developing countries, mainly in Asia, China and India. So it tends to be a little bit disingenuous when we blame them for their emissions, when in fact we've just restructured our own economies so that we push the emissions onto them. But it seems the only way to really account for emissions is to look at some sort of stock balance kind of approach. And given the difficulty of world trade negotiations, not to mention climate negotiations, I wonder how you might see that progress with us.
That's a example of an aren't I right question. So that's a good one. We'll try to get to that. Okay.
How about wasn't I right?
Wasn't I right? Yeah.
Diane Lavoie, House Intelligence Committee.
Hello, Diane. Nice to
Hi.
see you after all
Good
this
to see
time.
you. Well, this question is really, I think, particularly for you, Leon, and for Jim Woolsey. At least I'm thinking that way. The intelligence community is within our government in many imperfect ways where we do some thinking about things and we think ahead. It's one of the places. And I'm concerned about the kinds of thinking, and particularly in what you said, Leon, that are required. Systems thinking, network thinking, just different ways of thinking, and most importantly, as I think about the intelligence community, integrating these issues of climate change continually into geopolitical issues that we're dealing with constantly in the medium run, if not immediate things. So my question really is, how do you see improvement in our ability through the intelligence community to ensure that to enable this kind of thinking to permeate that kind of what the policy makers hear, that kind of challenge?
Adam Siegel, Energy Consensus. Two questions, both economic costs. The first one is traditionally disaster relief and otherwise. There's always the wringing the hands. If we'd always act preventively, the cost would have been low percentage versus. So in terms of security terms, didn't talk about it, but I don't know if it's in the report, of cost preventive in terms of security terms versus cost of responding in climate change systems. And also then for Ambassador Woolsey, of the cost, very interesting your ghost discussion of the tree hugger versus the hawk. What about on the cost versus benefit of, oh, it will cost too much of it's the environment versus the economy, rather than as per energy efficiency and otherwise, we can achieve much of this, if not all of this, by a true strengthening of the economy, especially if we have a systems concept of costs and benefits.
Okay, well, for the next few minutes, I think the gavel has been passed to me as visibly the oldest person around. So I'll call on my colleagues for their interventions.
Well, I'll touch on the Intel and the cost issue. I think that it's perfectly appropriate for the intelligence community to do as it was involved in actually getting one of the initial reports on this project, and take a hard look at the implications of climate change, not because there's anybody out there doing climate change that needs to have secrets stolen from them, which is kind of what intelligence organizations are in part for anyway, but rather because climate change over the course of the next, even the next decade or two, could begin to substantially affect the motivations of individuals and nation states. Probably one of the first things will be immigration from crop failures and weather patterns. I mean, if we think we have trouble coming to terms with an immigration bill now, what would it be like when millions of our hungry and thirsty southern neighbors head north for historic reasons, just as people have migrated away from economic chaos in the past. And if the intelligence community isn't paying attention to what may happen to our relations with, say, Mexico and Latin America in those circumstances, it's really not doing its job. So I very much believe that it ought to, and it is. They were one of the early people to get in touch with Kurt to get some of the benefits of this work. As far as cost is concerned on these changes, I think the whole Stern report issue in this has put things into a light that in a way obfuscates a big opportunity. The Rocky Mountain Institute and McKinsey have both looked very much at electricity use. Worldwide, 70% of electricity goes into buildings. If you just do the things that have an internal rate of return of 10% or better, things that make money, all right, you can hold, according to both of them, and Rocky Mountain Institute's more optimistic than McKinsey because it looks at interactive effects between the kind of lights you use and how much air conditioning you need and so forth. If you just look at things that make money, 10% IRR or better, they believe you can hold CO2 emissions at, you can do about half or a little bit more than what you would need to hold CO2 emissions at 550 parts per million, which is down about double where it was at the beginning of the industrial era, and isn't great, but is a lot better than a lot of what a lot of people are really worried about. And that's with money-making, Amory Levins calls them negawatts, money-making undertakings. We're finding with Walmart now, 20-30% savings just from simple things, painting the roof white, putting in some skylights, changing the light bulbs, etc. So there are a lot of opportunities here which do not involve spending a lot of money to the detriment of the economy. People need to, one final example, California 20 years ago decided to decouple earnings from revenues. Its Public Utility Commission did for utilities. So for the last 20 years, California has been investing in energy savings, and people utilities get a return on investment instead of on sales of electricity. California's, they haven't done everything right, God knows, but their electricity use per capita has been absolutely flat for 20 years. The rest of the country has gone up 60%. Hello? The rest of the public utility commissions ought to join California in figuring out that their incentives are wrong. The incentives are to waste electricity now. They're not to save it. Outside California and Idaho, which has now followed California, the other public utility commissions need to wake up.
Just make one point and then on to Leon if I can. I do think one of the arguments about why this is a national security issue and why it should be considered as such suggests that we, although I agree with Jim and others on our panel, that we're fairly close to some solutions that make very good market sense. But the truth is, if you believe, as I do, that some of the consequences that we might face would have absolutely destabilizing global consequences to peace and stability, then you have to start to think about a different calculus. And in national security, oftentimes, security doesn't really have a price tag. I would suggest that if we have $1 trillion to spend on Iraq, we probably have some amount of money that we should be thinking about in terms of creating incentives for certain kinds of both government-led and other investments. Now, the truth is the government has not been a very good predictor of technologies associated with energy. In fact, they don't have a particularly good track record in this regard. However, much of what underlies California's effectiveness, as Jim suggests, has been a role of a very subtle and capable government policy at the state level, and I think you could imagine more that could be done at the federal level along these lines.
Diane, one of the things I learned about intelligence in the course of of 3 decades of being an intense consumer of its products is that the consumer of the product has a responsibility, not just the producer. And the reason for that is because the quality of the intelligence you get is a function of the quality of the questions you ask. Lazy questions, rotten intelligence. questions that discourage analysts from telling truth to power, worse intelligence, because self-censored. As for the intelligence community, its primary responsibility, it sees it, and its congressional overseers see it, as is national security. The question is the definition of national security applied in the intelligence community and by the Congress too narrow, given the kinds of issues that we've been talking about, and I would say it certainly is. Mechanisms do not exist in the intelligence community for producing the kind of long-range intelligence relating to the environment that's needed, with the possible exception of the National Intelligence Council, which periodically produces long-range assessments of what the world will look like 10 or 15 years hence. But that is not focused on the environment. The environment is simply a subheading among many others. Now, it's true that in the past, as we became aware, and the government as a whole, of new challenges to national security, the intelligence community has adapted. So there are these, you take a transverse cut through the history of the community, and you find growth rings for things like non-proliferation, drug traffic, terrorism, where up to some point there was very little in the community that was really focused on this, few analysts, no systems, no money. And afterwards, sudden burst of institution building and human capital building. Now it's time for the environment to have that kind of a burst of activity. There was an effort during the 90s to create it. Some very interesting things were done. They were promptly shut down after the year 2000. I think it's time for intelligent people of all political persuasions to revisit those decisions and to decide that it's necessary to provide the intelligence community with the money needed to help it cover this new beat. And it's not a vast amount of money, but it's a lot more than they have at their disposal now for this purpose.
John, do you want last word?
Well, the one question that wasn't answered was the question of trade and the role of trading mechanisms in order to come to grips and grapple with this problem. And I think if you think about the cap and trade, either regionally, as we're experimenting with now in the Northeast or in the West Coast, nationally, as people have proposed, or globally, as is likely to occur probably not in the not too distant future. We're really talking about market-making mechanisms. We're making a market in the distribution of emissions, and that requires a kind of set of global rules that will build in transparency, accountability, etc. I worry a little bit about the direct linkage right now, because you see it with proposals on Capitol Hill that are largely, I think, aimed at a real problem that you've raised, which is that we've kind of offshored a lot of our manufacturing capacity and then are kind of whacking the people who are manufacturing when they import goods because they're not controlling their carbon emissions. Now, of course, we're not controlling ours either. So I think a tricky issue. It comes up in the agriculture sector as well, where the systems of inputs and outputs on with respect to agricultural trade, I think, tend to actually discourage the market for biomass-based fuels. But this is a big problem, and the linkages between the WTO rules and what may emerge as a global market in carbon and carbon offsets needs, I think, at least dialogue and discussion right now if we're going to likely to get it right. Maybe that goes back to the George Schultz comment that Jim made earlier, that beginning to experiment on the ground now will help us, I think, ladder up towards a system that is sustainable.
Let me thank you all for taking the time on this Monday morning to join us. We really appreciate your attention. The authors will remain around if anyone wants to have some off discussions. Thank you all very much.